Today I'm walking through 5 questions that will completely change your relationships, especially if you're successful in your career and continue to have the same results in your relationships. Let's get started. Why do successful women struggle in relationships? Well, let's look at it. When you're in your professional environment and you're doing your thing, right? Let's look at the things that come into play with that. One, you have structure. There's a hierarchy. Everyone knows their role and everyone's responsible in their respective areas. So, as a successful woman, you're leading teams. However, if someone on that team is repeatedly late with an assignment, what happens to that person? You hold that person accountable. You're going to address that issue with them and figure out how to correct it. So it becomes a shared opportunity there to be successful. You have your team and you have you as the leader of the team. And working together, you leads to success. Let's look at that same dynamic when it comes to your relationships. Typically, what may happen or may not happen, but typically what happens, that same level of structure that you have around you in your career, you don't bring that same structure into your relationships. Now, that may not seem appropriate. However, let's look at how that dynamic plays out when that structure is brought into the relationship. If you have an individual that you are involved with and you ask that individual to do something or they ask you to do something, there's a communication that takes place. However, if that person tells you that they're going to be somewhere and they don't show up, what happens? If that person is supposed to communicate to you what they have going on a particular day because you're trying to set schedules up and they don't do that, what do you do? And if it feels like this is a person that you like, you met this person, you all are hitting it off great, and you just like the way that things are going, but you find that you may be carrying more of the conversation or more of the weight of the relationship at that stage of the relationship, what do you do? Let's go back to your career and what happens when you're at work. If that individual doesn't show up and they're inconsistent, you take action at work. In a relationship, you need to bring that same standard with you. Hold that individual accountable for their actions because what that does is it sends a message. So instead of trying to figure out how to adjust, you observe the behavior and you act accordingly. Sounds reasonable, right? So now when it comes to communication and there's a disagreement or there may be, it may seem like there's something just a little off. So you find that you're the one who's trying to talk through everything and the other person may be like, well, just give me some time, or people tell you, give them some time, give them some time. Relationships are hard. However, if you were at work, you would take a completely different perspective and approach, right? Why should your relationship be any different? It's a partnership. So if you're having a situation to where you're trying to have a conversation about something that you all may not have agreed on, or there may have been a misunderstanding, and you're finding that you're the only one carrying the weight of that relationship to try to move it forward, maybe it's time to look at what your actions should be, observe the behavior, and adjust accordingly. You may not want to, but if the situation was in your career, you would. So you don't want to always be in a position where you're carrying all the weight, because what that in turn does to you is to have you over functioning in the relationship. And when you start over functioning in the relationship, there tends to be a point in time where you become exhausted. And once you become exhausted, things really have a tendency to go downhill. So at the end of the day, you have a structure professionally in your career. However, when it comes to your relationships, there's no emotional standard. So what we're going to work on is building that emotional standard, so it relieves some of that pressure off you and take your focus off of you being the main caregiver in the relationship, and you learn how to basically share the responsibility, or in other words, observe the behavior and respond accordingly. That's number one. What's a major mistake that successful women make in relationships? Well, one of them is over explaining. If you've explained something to a grown person, a grown man, once, and you find yourself continuously explain that same item or issue or point over and over again, at what point do you decide that enough is enough? You shouldn't have to over explain yourself when you're in conversation with another adult that's on your same level and understands you. Now, let's say that you have a situation to where you're planning events and attending events together and things of that sort, and that particular individual says they're going to be there and they don't show up, and that happens on more than one occasion. That person is showing you that they're inconsistent. What should your response be in that particular case? Let's roll back to your career. What would happen if an individual is supposed to be in a certain location, in a certain meeting with you, and you're showing up and they're not showing up? You're going to take the appropriate action with that individual, especially if you've already had a conversation on that particular subject. So bring that same structure from your career, your professional career, into your emotional standard requirements with this grown man. You're due that level of respect. But a lot of times, right, we have this tendency to believe that there's potential there, so we make exceptions and we allow actions that we would never allow in our professional careers. So when you start allowing and accepting those different behaviors because you think that there's potential in that individual, you're putting yourself into a cycle of tolerance, and that tolerance results in frustration, right? Now, when you really look back on the situation when you met this individual, you may have seen some what we call red flags, right? There was something about that individual that may not have necessarily set well with you. However, have you ever had that conversation where, yeah, such and such did this? Oh, but I just wiped it off. I just figured, it was something that happened that day. But then there's another flag over here, another action that the individual does that kind of triggers something that doesn't align with your spirit or your soul. And then something else happens on the other side, and you find yourself making excuses because when your girlfriends are asking you, "Hey, where's Tim?" or "Where's your man?" or where are they? And you start making excuses for them when you know in your heart of hearts that it was bugging you because it's something that has begun a pattern, and you start feeling as if you're not being considered, as if you're not important. When you hit that level, you have to take a look at the fact that maybe you've been negotiating things that should never be negotiable with you, which in turn impacts your emotional standards. So you've lowered your emotional standard for the hope of potential, or laid down your level of standards and ignore those red flags because there was something about this person that you like, maybe physically. However, when it comes to a level of taking care of your emotional standards, that same level of care is not provided to you that you've been providing to them, because you've made exceptions, you've made excuses, and you found yourself carrying the weight of that relationship because you believed in the potential. So at this stage, I encourage you to reference the actions. And after referring back to the actions, maybe it's time to take accountability for the results that need to happen next. Let's talk about that. So, what does it look like when you're examining the actions and behaviors when it comes to your emotional standards? Let's say your friend disappears for days. You haven't heard from him. You have no idea where he is. You sent text messages. You've called. However, that individual um, hasn't responded, and you're trying to have a calm conversation about the situation, and that individual still isn't receiving your communication and your efforts and reciprocating that. What does that tell you? So, what does it look like? These actions that are misaligned with your emotional standards. However, you always hear the term about commitment, and you have a friend that you are involved with, and you may have been involved with some months now. However, you aren't seeing the same level of commitment that you're displaying or sharing from that individual. So, how do you handle that? How are you addressing that? And are you in that position where the individual responds back and says, "Hey, hold up, let's not rush this, or let's not put a title on this." How do you deal with that? Because obviously you and he may not be on the same emotional standards category level, right? How does that make you feel? So once again, you're finding yourself carrying the weight of the relationship to a level all by yourself, which is a burden on your shoulders. And it gets heavy. You're giving the time, you're giving your energy, all in the hopes of that it balances out, and that individual at some point in time will begin reciprocating in the same fashion or on the same level that you've been providing that care and feeding of the relationship. And you've been slowly and slowly tolerating more and more, and feeling more frustrated as the weeks go on. And you're wondering, what else is it going to take for me to do? So you're making adjustments instead of evaluating the situation, because all the signs are there that you're not on the same emotional standards page. And from the previous actions that we spoke of, it doesn't appear that you all have the same end state in mind. So how do we fix that? So how do we fix that situation? There's a framework I created called STAND: self-awareness, truth, accountability, non-negotiable, and discipline. Working along that framework. So you define your standard and you set that. A lot of times we don't take the time to really sit down and figure out what our standards should be. And that leads to a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of expectations and a lot of failures. But once you establish your standard, then you have to enforce it and you have to stand by it. You have an emotional structure that you are not willing to negotiate. And then you're looking for consistency. Consistency is required. You have to have that. It's not an option. You have to have consistency that's on the same level that you're providing, right? And if your behavior isn't matching up with each other, then you have to have the courage to back off. There's no explanation. You're not receiving the same level of care and response as you've been providing. Save yourself, enforce your standard, and back off. Observe the patterns. If there are patterns there, don't make excuses. Don't ignore the red flags. Acknowledge them and take account of the behavior that's supporting those items. And if there's no corrective action that's being taken on behalf of that other individual, then once again, if you don't define your standard and stick to it, you'll accept whatever shows up. And that leads to overfunctioning, frustration, and at the end of the day, unhappiness, broken relationships. These are just some of the questions a successful woman can answer and should answer for every relationship that you may be encountering to determine if it is suitable for you. And if what I've shared with you today hits home, stay with me because we're going to go deeper into the STAND framework. But before I even do that, I want to leave you with one thing. When at the end of this podcast, after you finish listening, just take a moment and write down one standard that is non-negotiable for you. Write it down on a sheet of paper, write it down in a journal, but write down one standard that is non-negotiable for you. And if you're comfortable with sharing one word that represents that standard for you, leave it in the comments of the section of the after the podcast, because I want to know what you're standing on, and I want to support you. So, this is my movement entitled No More Small Talk, because today, women like yourself are having the hardest time in finding fruitful and fulfilling relationships. I'm coming from experience because I've experienced the same. And I like to help change that, turn the tide. Or better yet, provide a framework that will help successful women like yourself transform the relationships that you encounter into something that's more sustainable and happy. I'm your coach, Rod Johnson, and thank you for joining No More Small Talk. I'll see you next week. Have a great day.